they are very critical of the inability of Washington to focus on what is necessary, and their overreach. They think that the United States is overreaching. So they are very critical of the war, of the United States' role in, firstly, through Victoria Nuland, creating the circumstances through the coup d'etat against Viktor Yanukovych, the then president of Ukraine in 2014. They created the coup d'etat in order ethnically to cleanse Russian speakers from the eastern side of Ukraine, in order to provoke Putin into the first stage of war in 2014 against Ukraine, so as to push for NATO expansion in Scandinavia, and of course, Georgia and Ukraine. And so this pragmatic viewpoint simply says that we shouldn't be doing this, because that way we are pushing Russia into the arms of China. And the whole point of the Nixon administration was to split the Soviet Union from China and therefore win the Cold War. So they are critical of the support of Ukraine and of Israel, because they think that this simply disorients the United States policy. It creates alliances amongst Americans' enemies, like alliances between Russia and China, Iran and Russia, and so on. And that this is silly politics because the enemy is China. And China needs to be contained. And if you ask them, why does China need to be contained? China doesn't have a history of imperialism. China has absolutely no interest in building military bases on the US-Mexican border, in taking, naval power and projecting it to San Diego or Los Angeles or San Francisco. China doesn't want that. China wants to trade. You know what they say? Yes, we agree. But if we let China become a regional superpower in the Pacific area, in its own area, in its backyard, if we allow China, for instance, to become dominant in the South China Sea and in the Indian Ocean, then China in the future will start trying to do what we have done. And they will become an imperialistic force in the Western Hemisphere, which for them is the Americas. This is what they say. They understand that China is not imperialistic, but they fear that if they do not contain China through choke points, just north of Indonesia, the first array of islands, the second array of islands between China and the Philippines and so on, then China will emulate the United States, and therefore you better prevent that by choking China today. So that's one line of argument. The second line of argument is the opposite argument, that the United States must be a bully everywhere, all over the world, including in Europe, including the Ukraine, and that, for instance, I have been told that by somebody who was very high up in the Bush administration and who was very high up in the chain of command of NATO in Brussels, an American Republican. He said to me that we need to expand NATO against the interests of the Europeans. He was clear, against the interests of the Europeans. And I said to him, Bob, why? He said, because of three reasons. First, because we must be in Europe, the United States, to keep ourselves in. Number one reason he gave me. Number two, to keep the Germans down. Look at the price of electricity in Germany today as a result of the war in Ukraine. The German industrial machine is finished, kaput, as a result, not just of that, but that is one of the reasons. And thirdly, to keep the Russians out. So this is, if you were in the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., this is the discussion you would hear. The containment of China, the choking of China, is common ground for all of them. They simply disagree on how to do it best, whether to do it through the war in Ukraine or, as Trump suggests, end the war in Ukraine and concentrate on China. Well, this, so far, what I have presented to you, is more or less common knowledge amongst anyone who's ever been in Washington, been in Brussels, spoken to these people, to the Cold Warriors, to the new Cold Warriors. This is common knowledge. But I think that that story that I've given you so far is incomplete. Why did the Clinton administration and the Bush administration after that were so gung-ho about trading with China? Why did they not start the new Cold War against China in the 1990s, in the year 2000, in 2004, 2005, 2008? Why was it only around 2014 that this establishment decided to unleash the war against China? It's not that they... One explanation is that the Clinton administration people could not see that China would develop to the extent that China developed, that it would become so big. I don't believe that. I never believe explanations which presume the stupidity of the people involved. I don't believe that these people were stupid. And I don't believe that they didn't see that by shifting half of American manufacturing to the west coast of China, to the east coast of China, that, that China would not grow and develop. They knew it. They were celebrating it. I remember, for years hearing that, capitalism is fantastic because look at China. The moment it introduced the market economy, and they become a superpower. So they knew it and they wanted it. Why don't they want it now? Why is it suddenly choking points and containment and, putting a boot on their neck? What really changed? For me, the essence of the pursuit of a new Cold War against China by the United States, by the way, Europe is irrelevant. Europe is simply doing as it's told. Europe doesn't want to unleash a Cold War against China, but, they get the email from Washington, D.C., do it, and they do it. Against their interests and against their wishes. So don't care about the Europeans. It's Washington. If you were somebody like, a strategic thinker like Henry Kissinger, who is now dead, but this is the example of the deep thinking American official, what would you really be worried about? Since I mentioned Kissinger, let me stick to him for a moment. The year was 1970. Kissinger, at the time, who was working for President Nixon, you'll recall, was not the foreign minister, was not in the State Department yet. He was the head of the National Security Council, and he was the National Security Advisor to the American president. And he was the epitome, all his life, of American strategic thinking, the thinking of that one-party state, the deep state of the United States. Being a smart man, when he saw the macroeconomic statistics, and he saw that from 1968 onwards, America, for the first time since the 1930s, had become a deficit country. For the first time in its history, since it became a superpower or an important power in the mid-war period, and certainly since the 1950s, when it was the only superpower in terms of economic superpower, the United States slipped from being a surplus country, from having a surplus in its trade balance, to having a deficit. And Kissinger was worried because he knew that, historically speaking, every empire that went from being a surplus to a deficit economic entity started fading. So he got together his people at the National Security Council, and he asked them a simple question. What should we do in order to retain our hegemony now that we are a deficit country? And he said to the people, go away and think about it, and I want from each one of you half a page of a note. Very interesting, right? Not 20 pages, half a page. Not a page, half a page. This is how Kissinger worked. And these were very smart people, right? Most of them came back and gave a very Germanic answer.